Imagine it's the year 50 BCE. You're not a noble or a soldier, you're just an average Roman citizen, maybe a laborer or a street vendor trying to get by in the bustling city of Rome. You've just finished a long day hauling amphorae at the docks or sweeping marble floors in a senator's villa. Your stomach's growling and dinner can't come soon enough. But forget about delicacies or grand feasts. There are no elite chefs, no banquets in your honor. Just whatever humble ingredients you can afford with a few worn-down coins. You sit near a small hearth or squat in a crowded insular apartment building as someone hands you a bowl of something steaming. Chickpeas, millet porridge, stale bread soaked in cheap wine, maybe a few olives if you're lucky. Wait, you might find yourself thinking, is this all the Romans were eating? Well, for the common people, yes. Because while emperors dined in luxury, regular ancient Romans had to get creative and cheap just to survive. So what exactly did they eat to fill their bellies without emptying their purses? Let's dig into 15 cheap meals ancient Romans ate to stay alive. 15. Puls, starting with puls. Puls was a thick porridge made from farro, barley, or millet, whichever grain was cheapest or available that week. Cooks would boil the grains down with water until they turned soft and sticky, then toss in any scraps on hand, maybe some crushed herbs, a splash of olive oil if they could afford it, or leftover vegetables that were just about to go bad. Meat was rare, and if it found its way into the pot, it was usually in the form of a salty, chewy chunk from yesterday's stew. It wasn't meant to impress, it was meant to fill. And for most Romans, especially the working class, it did just that. Puls kept you going. It was fuel. You'd eat it for breakfast, maybe dinner too, sometimes cold if you had to save a portion overnight. It was basic, but it laid the foundation for nearly every other cheap meal on this list. Because once you had puls, you had something to build on. 14th. Panis plebeius. Once you had puls, you could survive the day. But even the most grateful stomach can grow tired of the same sticky porridge, day in and day out. That's where the Roman instinct to improvise kicked in. When you didn't have variety, you created it. Some would fry leftover puls into little cakes the next morning, crisping the edges to trick their mouths into thinking it was something new. But for those lucky enough to have a few extra coins or friends in the countryside, there was another fallback: panis. Bread wasn't just food, it was currency, comfort, and survival rolled into one. And we're not about talking soft, fluffy loaves. This was coarse, dense stuff, often made with a mix of wheat, barley, and whatever flour could be scraped together. Panis plebeius, the people's bread, was baked hard enough to last for days. You'd soak it in wine or water just to make it chewable. But when hunger pressed in, that brick of bread became a lifeline. And where there was bread, there was a chance to turn a meal into something more. Because if you had bread, you could dip it into something like the next staple that kept Romans afloat. 13th. Maritum bread alone could only do so much. After days of gnawing on rock-hard crusts, even the hungriest Romans started craving flavor, something sharp, something that woke the senses. That's where maritum came in. Maritum was a rustic spread made by grinding garlic, herbs, salt, olive oil, and crumbly cheese into a thick paste. It was unapologetically pungent. You'd mash it all together in a mortar with a pestle until the mixture was smooth and vibrant. The result wasn't elegant, but it didn't need to be. It was powerful. One bite cleared your sinuses and reminded you that, yes, your taste buds were still alive. The poor loved it, not just for its flavor, but because it made even the driest bread feel like a treat. A smear of maritum turned a meal from punishment to pleasure. And it was cheap. Everything could be grown or made at home. No need for fancy ingredients, just strong hands and strong stomachs. 12th. Posca. After biting into a chunk of bread smothered with maritum, you'd need something to wash it down. For the average Roman, especially soldiers and laborers that drink, was posca. It wasn't wine, not really. Posca was made by mixing sour wine vinegar with water, sometimes tossed with herbs or a bit of honey if you had it. Cheap, simple, and everywhere. It wasn't served to impress. It was meant to hydrate, disinfect, and make grimy water drinkable. Soldiers on long marches swore by it. Poor families drank it with meals, not for enjoyment, but because it was safer than water and stronger than nothing. It had a bite, tangy, acidic, and unforgettable. But that sourness helped cut through greasy food or heavy grains. And more than anything, it filled the role of something cold in the heat or something warm on rough days. It was survival in a cup. And with all that sourness and saltiness going around, there had to be something on the side. Something that came in jars, lasted for weeks, and added a pop of flavor to every bite. The kind of thing even the poorest Roman could find at a stall or market corner. 11. Olives. If you wandered through any Roman marketplace or passed by a modest dinner table, there was one thing you'd almost always spot: olives. Jars of them lined shelves, baskets full, sat by vendors, and nearly every meal, rich or poor, had a few within reach. They were cheap, easy to store, and didn't spoil quickly, exactly what you needed when money was tight and fridges didn't exist. Some were brined, others packed in oil, and a few so bitter you had to soak them for days before they were edible. But once they were ready, they packed a punch, salty, slightly sour, and full of oil that kept you full longer than you'd expect. People would eat them straight, toss them into porridge, or smash them into spreads. They weren't just a snack, they were survival. And because olive trees were common across the region, they were often bartered or shared. 10. Dried figs. Right next to jars of olives, you'd often find a bundle of dried figs, shriveled, sweet, and packed with energy. For everyday Romans, they were one of the few affordable indulgences. No cooking, no preparation, just grab and eat. Figs grew easily across the region, which made them cheap and abundant. Drying them meant they lasted longer, traveled better, and could be eaten year-round, not just during harvest. Kids snacked on them, workers tucked a few into their satchels, and elders chewed them slowly like medicine. They were more than a treat. Figs gave you sugar when you had none, fiber when your diet was heavy with starch, and a sense of fullness when your stomach begged for more. You could even mash them into sauces or bake them into flat cakes for festivals. 9. Roasted turnips. After the sweetness of dried figs, the Romans often turned to something more grounded, literally. Turnips were one of the most common root vegetables around, especially for the poor. They grew fast, didn't need rich soil, and could survive in rough conditions, just like the people eating them. Most of the time, they were roasted over open flames or tossed into boiling water until tender. No butter, no fancy herbs, just heat and patience. The result was earthy, soft, and a little bitter, but when your stomach was empty, that bitterness tasted like comfort. Turnips were also easy to grow at home or forage in nearby fields. For the average Roman trying to stretch a meal, they were a blessing, cheap, filling, and dependable. You could mash them, eat them whole, or slice them into stews to bulk things up. And speaking of stews, when you had a mix of leftovers, scraps, and whatever was lying around, there was one go-to dish to bring it all together. 8. Vegetable stew. When scraps piled up and single ingredients weren't enough to make a meal, Romans turned to one simple solution: stew. Whether you called it minutal or just a rustic pottage, this was the catch-all dish that made use of everything: wilted greens, tired roots, stale bread, a pinch of herbs, maybe even a bone if someone was feeling generous. The pot stayed warm for hours, slowly softening whatever was thrown in. Lentils, onions, cabbage, turnips, chickpeas, all boiled together until the flavors mixed into something hearty and familiar. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, filling, and easy to stretch. One batch could feed a whole family. What made it essential wasn't the ingredients, it was the method. No recipe, just instinct and need. Stews gave the illusion of plenty when there wasn't much at all, and once the bowl was scraped clean, many Romans reached for a final bite, something dry, crunchy, and surprisingly satisfying. A food that needed no fire, just a strong jaw and an empty stomach. Septiem, bucellatum, Once the stew was gone and only crumbs remained, many Romans reached for something tough but dependable called buccellatum. This was twice-baked bread, more like a biscuit or a rusk than the soft loaves we know today. Hard as stone, dry as dust, and nearly indestructible, buccellatum was built to last. It wasn't a treat, though. It was survival food, what soldiers carried into battle, and what the poor kept in storage for hard times. You didn't bite into it so much as soak it first, usually in water, wine, or even stew leftovers, just to soften the edges enough to chew. Still, it served its purpose. It filled stomachs, traveled well, and never went bad. When everything else ran out, buccellatum was the fallback. People often crumbled it into soups or chewed it slowly with olives or garlic paste, stretching meals that weren't meant to last. And while dry food filled the gap, there were also small things, little, easy-to-miss ingredients that made those meals taste a bit more alive. One of the most common was a sharp little bite from the fields. 6. Wild onions and leeks. When meals were bland and bread felt like chewing on bricks, Romans reached for something with bite, wild onions and leeks. These humble greens grew in the wild and on the edges of farms, often ignored by the rich but treasured by the poor. They didn't cost a thing if you knew where to look. Picked fresh, they added a sharp, zesty flavor to otherwise flat dishes. People chopped them into stews, crushed them into spreads, or simply ate them raw with a hunk of bread. They woke up the palate, cleared the sinuses, and helped stretch the same old ingredients into something that tasted new. Farmhands would carry a few in their satchels. Soldiers packed them on the move. Even city dwellers made use of them when market stalls offered little else. They weren't glamorous, but they were there when you needed them. And when the stomach still grumbled after a simple meal, sometimes the answer wasn't another course, but something sweet and sticky that could linger just a little longer on the tongue. 5. Libum. After days of garlic, grains, and bitter greens, every Roman hoped for a moment of sweetness, and when they could manage it, that moment came in the form of libum. These were simple honey cakes, made with just a few ingredients: flour, cheese, and honey. Nothing fancy, but enough to taste like something special. Poor Romans didn't have desserts often. Honey was precious, and cheese even more so. But on feast days, religious offerings, or lucky weeks when ingredients stretched far enough, libum would show up on the table, soft and fragrant. Sometimes baked on a hot stone, other times wrapped in leaves, these little cakes were shared among families, savored slowly and remembered for days. They were sweet, but not rich, dense, but satisfying. You didn't need much, just a bite or two to lift your spirits and quiet the cravings. But not all sweets came from the oven. Sometimes Romans turned to something even simpler. Dried, dark, and full of flavor, it was a snack straight from the trees, no baking required. 4th. Dried dates. When libum wasn't possible, and most days it wasn't, Romans turned to something even easier: dried dates. Sticky, sweet, and packed with energy, they were nature's candy long before sugar was ever a household staple. Grown in warmer regions and traded throughout the empire, dates found their way into Roman markets, and more importantly, into the hands of those who needed a quick, filling bite. They didn't need to be cooked, stored well without spoiling, and tasted like a small reward in a hard life. Poor families would snack on them between meals, use them to sweeten porridge, or mash them into rough pastes for spreading over bread or mixing into grain cakes. Even when life was bitter, dates brought a touch of comfort. You didn't need many, just one or two to feel a little less empty. And as much as Romans relied on sweet bites like this, they also counted on reliable, earthy staples. One of the most overlooked, but most dependable, was a humble legume that carried a surprising punch. 3. Lentils. Next, we have lentils. Small, earthy, and endlessly useful, these humble legumes were a cornerstone of the poor man's diet. You could buy them cheap, store them dry for months, and cook them into just about anything. When mixed with herbs, onions, or a splash of oil, lentils became more than just filler, they became fuel. They didn't need attention or care, just a pot of boiling water and time. Some families cooked them down into stews, while others mashed them into pastes or ate them cold the next day. There was nothing glamorous about them, but they got the job done. They were hearty enough to fill your belly, gentle enough to eat daily, and flexible enough to pair with nearly every other scrap of food available. Whether you were feeding one or a crowd, lentils were the silent backbone of countless meals. But even the most basic meals needed seasoning, and for the Romans, one particular sauce did more than just add flavor, it was a way of life. 2. Garum lentils could carry a meal, but Romans knew flavor was everything, and when they wanted to bring a dish to life, they reached for garum. This wasn't just a sauce, it was the sauce. Fermented fish guts and salt left to stew under the sun until it turned into a strong, salty liquid that Romans poured on just about everything. It sounds intense, and it was. But once you got used to the smell, garum became addictive. It added depth, tang, and an umami hit long before that word even existed. Even the poorest households tried to get their hands on the cheapest version. A few drops could make plain lentils taste like something richer. Bread dipped in it felt like a full meal. And when boiled vegetables were all you had, garum made them feel like something more. It wasn't a side dish or a snack, it was survival seasoning. And with that, the Roman table was nearly set. Still, there was one last simple food that often rounded things off, small, sour, and easy to overlook. 1. Pickled vegetables. After the bold, salty kick of garum, Romans often balanced their meals with something sharp and tangy, pickled vegetables. Cucumbers, onions, cabbage, beets, whatever was in season or about to spoil, got tossed in vinegar and stored in jars. It wasn't just about taste. Pickling made food last, and when your pantry was bare, those sour bites became a kind of small luxury. Pickled veggies cut through the heaviness of grains and stews, brought life to stale bread, and paired well with nearly every other item on the Roman table. They were crunchy, mouth-puckering, and dependable, something you could always keep on hand. A few slices could turn a bland lunch into something memorable. For poor Romans, variety didn't come from having more food, it came from finding new ways to use what little they had, and pickling was one of their best tricks. So while emperors feasted on exotic meats and wine, the rest of Rome got by on meals like these, simple, strong, and built to endure. It's easy to romanticize Roman banquets and golden goblets, but the real story of ancient food isn't told in palaces. It's told in crowded kitchens, street stalls, and smoky pots bubbling with whatever could be spared. Don't forget to share, save, and come hungry for the next one.